Hey everybody, this is a piece by Neil Larsen titled The Jargon of Decoloniality. It was published in Catalyst. The abstract says, calls to, quote, decolonize academic production may invoke progressive anti-Eurocentrism, but the theory of decoloniality identified with works by Walter Mignolo only trades in the most objectionable aspects of identity politics, cloaked in an impenetrable jargon. Decoloniality dehistoricizes and culturalizes colonialism, promotes some odious autocracies. Promoting some odious autocracies along the way. And Wikipedia says Walter D. Mignolo, born 1941, is an Argentine semiotician, School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, and professor at Duke University, who has published extensively on semiotics and literary theory, and worked on different aspects of the modern colonial world, exploring concepts such as decoloniality, global coloniality, the geopolitics of knowledge, transmodernity, border thinking, and pluriversality. Walter Mignolo is one of the founders of the modernity/coloniality critical school of thought. Mignolo co-edits the web dossier, Words and Knowledge Otherwise. Walter Mignolo is the academic director of Duke in the Andes, an interdisciplinary program in Latin America and Andean Studies in Quito, Ecuador, at the Politecnica Salesiana University. Since 2000, he has directed the Center for Global Studies and Humanities, a research unit within the John Hope Franklin Center for Interdisciplinary and International Studies at Duke. Walter Mignolo has also been named permanent researcher at large at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Quito, Ecuador. Most recently, Mignolo has ventured into what he calls, quote, decolonial aesthetics, writing on artists Pedro Lash, Fred Wilson, Tanya Ostojic. I don't know if I'm saying that right. He contributed to Black Mirror / Espejo Negro, a book on the works of Pedro Lash, edited by Lash, published by Duke University Press. So here we go. Probably gonna have to break this video. I might have to break this video up into multiple sections if it gets long, because I am not an expert on Walter Mignolo, or decoloniality. So I'll have to look things up if I don't know what they are. So forgive me for that. So anyway, section 1. It's now been a number of years since the term, quote, decolonial, together with its more activated verbal inflection, quote, decolonize, have become a familiar across popular and media culture, especially in connection with identity politics. Still another variant, quote, decoloniality, joins these, though it is restricted to a narrower and more arcane academic lexicon. Quote, decolonization, located at a middle brow point of discursive insertion, has by now followed. Here, however, those with sufficient awareness, if not a residual memory of its historical context, will recognize in, quote, decolonization an older term with a distinct political resonance that can be traced considerably further back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, if not earlier, to the 1916 Easter Rising in Ireland and the 1919 Amritsar massacre in British-ruled India. Certainly by the time of the historic 1955 Bandung Conference, a relatively newly independent and henceforth, for a time, non-aligned former colonies in Asia and Africa, a term such as, quote, decolonial, would have been indissolubly linked to contemporary anti-colonial national liberation movements and to the actual historical process of decolonization, then roughly at its apogee, particularly in what remained of formal European colonialism in many parts of Asia and much of Africa. Not coincidentally, it was also a time well before the decolonial's most immediate precursor among current academic jargon, the quote post-colonial, began making its appearance. This was in the 1980s, thanks in part to the earlier appearance and impact of Edward Said's landmark book, Orientalism, published in 1978. The intellectual ascendancy of post-structuralism and postmodernism had clearly left an imprint on this terminology as well. The post-colonial, comprising post-colonial theory, post-colonial studies, and post-colonial literature, seems so far to have resisted displacement by the decolonial. This is probably due to the rhetorical advantages of post-colonialism's more narrowly descriptive and less militant resonance when it comes, for example, to such things as academic hiring and curricula. A clear advantage of, quote, decolonial over, quote, post-colonial, however, is how easily it can be transformed into the imperative or exhortative, more conveniently transitive verb, quote, decolonize. This, as best as I can render it, means to, quote, eliminate the racism from, end quote, or, quote, expose the Eurocentric bias in, end quote, any given target perceived to be in need of such denunciation or critique. Along with more and more publications featuring the term, quote, decolonizing, e.g. book titles such as Decolonizing the Map, Decolonizing the University, and Decolonizing Data, see the new, quote, decolonize that, exclamation point, series. Being published by OR Books, with 2022 titles such as Decolonize Museums, Decolonize Hipsters, Decolonize Self-Care, and the forthcoming Decolonize Multiculturalism. The post-colonial will clearly not lend itself nearly so well to this kind of slogan making. This is no doubt one reason for the challenge on post-colonialism's left flank to its niche as the more conventional status quo jargon. 2. Section 2. Yet slogans built around the terms, quote, decolonial and, quote, decolonize may in certain instances be traceable to, quote, decoloniality, despite its being the more narrowly academic term of art, and even to a Spanish original, quote, decolonialidad. It may not be possible to be certain about this, but we likely owe such a possible crossover in significant part to the critic and scholar Walter D. Mignolo. Occupying an endowed chair at Duke University, Mignolo is without doubt the most frequently cited authority in the current explosion of scholarship proclaiming political and theoretical allegiance to decoloniality. Footnote. An informal survey of dozens of articles featuring the terms, quote, decolonial and, quote, decoloniality, archived on the well-known, quote, academia.edu website, showed near universal allegiance to, or at least general approbation of, such authority. And footnote. A native of Argentina, initially trained as a scholar of both semiotics and Latin American literature of the colonial period, Mignolo credits the late Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano with introducing the concept of decoloniality, here in relation to Quijano's theory of the, quote, colonial matrix of power, end quote. Originally, quote, la colonialidad del poder. Purportedly first articulated in his 1991 article titled Colonialidad y Modernidad / Racionalidad, which translates as coloniality and modernity / rationality. Let me look up this person. Wikipedia says Anibal Quijano, who lived from 1928 to 2018, was a Peruvian sociologist and humanist thinker, known for having developed the concepts of, quote, coloniality of power and, quote, coloniality of knowledge. His body of work has been influential in the fields of decolonial studies and critical theory. I'm going to look up these concepts. The coloniality of power is a concept interrelating the practices and legacies of European colonialism in social orders and forms of knowledge advanced in post-colonial studies, decoloniality, and Latin American subaltern studies, most prominently by Anibal Quijano. It identifies and describes the living legacy of colonialism in contemporary societies in the form of social discrimination that outlived formal colonialism and became integrated in succeeding social orders. The concept identifies the racial, political, and social hierarchical orders imposed by European colonialism in Latin America that prescribed value to certain peoples/societies while disenfranchising others. Quijano argues that the colonial structure of power resulted in a caste system where Spaniards were ranked at the top and those that they conquered at the bottom due to their different phenotypic traits and a culture presumed to be inferior. This categorization resulted in a persistent, categorical, and discriminatory discourse that was reflected in the social and economic structure of the colony, and that continues to be reflected in the structure of modern post-colonial societies. Mario Lugones expands the definition of coloniality of power by noting that it imposes values and expectations on gender as well, in particular related to the European ranking of women as inferior to men. The concept was also expanded upon by Ramon Gros-Fuguel, Walter Mignolo, Sylvia Winter, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Santiago Castro Gomez, Catherine Walsh, Roberto Hernandez, Maria Lugones. Anibal Quijano's work on the subject, quote, had wide repercussions among Latin American decolonial scholars in the North American Academy, end quote. The Grupo Modernidad Colonialidad, Modernity/Coloniality Group, is an active network of intellectuals spanning generations and disciplines that are expanding on this work. And then the coloniality of knowledge is a concept that Peruvian sociologist Anibal Quijano developed and adapted to contemporary decolonial thinking. The concept critiques what proponents call the Eurocentric system of knowledge, arguing the legacy of colonialism survives within the domains of knowledge. For decolonial scholars, the coloniality of knowledge is central to the functioning of the coloniality of power, and is responsible for turning colonial subjects into victims of the coloniality of being, a term that refers to lived experience of colonized people. Okay, so back to the text. In Mignolo's numerous writings stretching far back as 1995's The Darker Side of the Renaissance, Literacy, Territoriality, and Colonization, and comprising his 2000 monograph, Local Histories/Global Designs, Coloniality, Subaltern Knowledges, and Border Thinking, decoloniality has either yet to make its literal appearance or has still not assumed its currently commandeering discursive position. I'm going to look up these books now. So, the description for the darker side of the Renaissance, Literacy, Territoriality, and Colonization, by Walter Mignolo says, the darker side of the Renaissance weaves together literature, semiotics, history, historiography, cartography, and cultural theory to examine the role of language in the colonization of the New World, exploring the many connections among writing, social organization, and political control, including how alphabetic writing is linked with the exercise of power. Walter D. Mignolo claims that European forms of literacy were at the heart of New World colonization. It has long been acknowledged that Amerindians were at a disadvantage in facing European invaders because native cultures did not employ the same kind of texts, hence, quote, knowledge that the Europeans valued. That no one but Mignolo has so thoroughly examined either the process or the implications or conquest and destruction through language. The book continues to challenge commonplace understandings of New World history and to stimulate new colonial and post-colonial scholarship. Walter D. Mignolo is professor in the Department of Romance Studies in the program in literature at Duke University. So that's that book, The Darker Side of the Renaissance. And the next book, Local History / Global Designs, Coloniality, Subaltern Knowledges, and Border Thinking. The description of which says, Local history / global designs is an extended argument about the, quote, coloniality of power by one of the most innovative Latin American and Latino scholars. In a shrinking world where sharp dichotomies such as East-West and developing / developed blur and shift, Walter Mignolo points to the inadequacy of current practices in the social sciences and area studies. He explores the crucial notion of, quote, colonial difference in the study of the modern colonial world and traces the emergence of an epistemic shift, which he calls, quote, border thinking. Further, he expands the horizons of those debates already underway in post-colonial studies of Asia and Africa by dwelling in the genealogy of thoughts of South / Central America, the Caribbean, and Latinas / Latinas in the United States. Walter Mignolo's concept of, quote, border gnosis, or sensing and knowing by dwelling in imperial colonial borderlands, counters the tendency of Occidentalist perspectives to manage and thus limit understanding. Back to the text. Up until Mignolo's 2011 book, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, first preference is still being given to earlier coinages, such as Mignolo's erstwhile favorite, post-Occidentalism, and to the by then and still ubiquitous, quote, border thinking. I tried looking up border thinking just now. I couldn't find what it means. There's an AI overview. It says, border thinking, a term coined by scholars like Walter Mignolo and Gloria Ansaldúa, refers to a way of thinking that emerges from the experience of living in or analyzing borderlands and colonial differences. It emphasizes the importance of subaltern perspectives, alternative epistemologies, and decolonizing knowledge. Essentially, it's about recognizing and valuing knowledge and experiences from the margins, challenging dominant perspectives and structures. So that's what at least says on the AI overview says. Let's look up this other book. Okay, so the description for The Darker Side of Western Modernity, Global Futures, Decolonial Options by Walter D. Mignolo says, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, coloniality emerged as a new structure of power as Europeans colonized the Americas and built on the ideas of Western civilization and modernity as the endpoints of historical time and Europe as the center of the world. Walter D. Mignolo argues that coloniality is the darker side of Western modernity, a complex matrix of power that has been created and controlled by Western men and institutions from the Renaissance, when it was driven by Christian theology, through the late 20th century and the dictates of neoliberalism. This cycle of coloniality is coming to an end. Two main forces are challenging Western leadership in the early 21st century. One of these, quote, de-Westernization, is an irreversible shift to the East in struggles over knowledge, economics, and politics. The second force is, quote, decoloniality. Mignolo explains that decoloniality requires delinking from the colonial matrix of power underlying Western modernity to imagine and build global futures in which human beings and the natural world are no longer exploited in the relentless quest for wealth accumulation. Back to the text. I'm going to see if there's anything for post-Occidentalism. Not really seeing anything on this. Anyway, back to the text. Footnote. The perhaps not so ironic sound and flavor of speculative finance and the commodity trading floor, quote, futures, right next to, quote, options, is hard to miss in the subtitle. At this point, quote, decolonial, has made it to the front cover, even if following the standard academic colon, and sharing second billing with the then still highly fashionable term, quote, global. And that's in reference to the book, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, Global Futures, Decolonial Options. End footnote. In all the iterations of Mignolo's high-visibility theorizing, however, the allegedly subversive, de-Westernizing thrust of what is now an officially trademarked decoloniality is traced back to a point long predating the near-contemporary inception of its jargon. Its origins purportedly go all the way back to the beginnings of the European penetration, conquest, and colonization of the Americas, Africa, and southern and eastern Asia in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. As such, what is claimed to be the subversive power of contemporaneous decoloniality is already said to reside in an indigenous non-European decolonial resistance, a resistance to which Europe's first colonial exploits assuredly did give rise. Footnote. Situated in the origins of the theory, if not literally the jargon, at a point in the past long predating the introduction of the terminology itself, is a move already well rehearsed in the early escapades of post-colonialism. Witness, for example, Robert J.C. Young's Post-Colonialism, a historical introduction originally published in 2003. Here are such historic pre-post-colonial, anti-colonial, and revolutionary figures such as Mohandas Gandhi, Frantz Fanon, and Ernesto Che Guevara are explicitly claimed as virtual founders of post-colonial theory, thereby appearing to lend something of their revolutionary anti-colonial credentials, according to Robert J.C. Young's anachronistic reconstruction, to the post-structuralism of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. For a critique, see also Sarika Chandra and Neil Larsen's article, Post-Colonial Pedigrees, published in Cultural Critique 62, Winter 2006. End footnote. Whatever the truth and whatever the terminology currently affixed to and projected back onto them, the social and political legacy and importance of such historical struggles are often ignored and underplayed. But in lieu of their deeper historical analysis, which prevails in Mignolo's work, is what I will refer to as the mere jargon of decoloniality, often descending into outright bombast. Footnote. In fairness, much the same can be said although with varying degrees of turgidity, of a number of other contemporary proponents of colonial, quote, theory, among whom Mignolo himself has continued to stand out as a leading mouthpiece. These include, strictly inter alia, Ramon Gros Foguel, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Santiago Castro Gomez, Mignolo's occasional co-author, Catherine E. Walsh. Although I find much to criticize in his later work, tending as it does toward hollow, Mignolo-esque jargon, I hesitate to include the still justly renowned Argentine-Mexican scholar, philosopher, and liberation theologian Enrique Dussel, whose record of genuine intellectual integrity is vouchsafed by, among other earlier work, his important 1988 contribution to Marx scholarship. I have a review of that book. It says, Hacia un Marx des conocido un comentario de los manuscritos del 61 to 63. I forget how to say numbers in Spanish. But that book's about the manuscripts that would become theories of surplus value from 1861 to 63. I read that book, but I believe I have a review of that book by Chris Arthur on this channel. It was a good book. I agree with this observation here. Quijano himself, despite his long, eminent, and often brilliant history, is one of the key representatives of the great tradition of Marxian historiography and social science at Lima's National University of San Marcos during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and what were for many years his contributions as a visiting scholar to the Emanuel Wallerstein Circle at SUNY Binghamton's Fernand Braudel Center, finally succumbs to the jargon of decoloniality, helping to provide one of its conceptual tripwires with the formulation of the theory of the, quote, coloniality of power. Here, the inversion, quasi-Foucauldian, is strategic. Why not the more unambiguously historicizable, quote, power of coloniality, end quote, or even simply the, quote, power of colonialism, end quote. To my mind, this deceptively simple inversion constitutes the crucial, albeit late and regrettable, dehistoricizing category mistake in Quijano's thinking. Quijano's relationship to, quote, decoloniality can perhaps be compared to the relationship of Said to post-colonialism, sharing responsibility for its political pitfalls, even if still more politically defensible, the many who then claimed to be his acolytes. End footnote. This is certainly most true of Mignolo's most recent book in English, The Politics of Decolonial Investigations. Hereafter, PDCI. I'll try to remember that it's Politics of Decolonial Investigations. Is a newly introduced collection of 14 previously published and evidently somewhat revised essays and articles totaling well over 500 pages. The description of the Politics of Decolonial Investigations by Walter D. Mignolo says, in the Politics of Decolonial Investigations, Walter D. Mignolo provides a sweeping examination of how coloniality has operated around the world in its myriad forms from the 16th to the 21st century. Decolonial border thinking allows Mignolo to outline how the combination of the self-fashioned narratives of Western civilization and the hegemony of Eurocentric thought serve to eradicate all knowledges in non-European languages and praxes of living and being. Mignolo also traces the geopolitical origins of racialized and gendered classifications, modernity, globalization, and cosmopolitanism, placing them all within the framework of coloniality. Drawing on the work of theorists and decolonial practitioners from the global South and the global East, Walter D. Mignolo shows how coloniality has provoked the emergence of decolonial politics initiated by delinking from all forms of Western knowledge and subjectivities. The urgent task, Mignolo stresses, is the epistemic reconstitution of categories of thought and praxes of living destituted in the very process of building Western civilization and the idea of modernity. The overcoming of the long-lasting hegemony of the West and its distorted legacies is already underway in all areas of human existence. Mignolo underscores the relevance of the politics of decolonial investigations in and outside the academy to liberate ourselves from canonized knowledge, ways of knowing, and praxes of living. Back to the text. The near total uniformity, consistency, and monotony. With near total uniformity, consistency, and monotony, the politics of decolonial investigations reads as a loop of quasi-ritualized, self-repeating, almost incantatory terms and phrases that, in their sheer vertiginous range and repetitiveness, parody a genuine theoretical system. Quiano, celebrated here as a kind of oracle, hailed as we are repeatedly reminded from the, quote, South American Andes, end quote, is credited by Mignolo with the exposure of an all-pervasive Western and Eurocentric, quote, colonial matrix of power, end quote, or CMP. Footnote. The redundancy is symptomatic here. Is there a North American or European Andean mountain range somewhere from which the mythical pure original site of an Incan Tahuantinsuyo has been deviously uprooted? Even physical geography is apparently in danger of being, quote, re-westernized. End footnote. To this, an opposing, quote, decolonial option is held out to those of us prepared or culturally or ethnically predisposed to, quote, delink, i.e. practice, quote, epistemic disobedience, end quote. In response to anyone rude enough to observe the intra-academic boundaries of decoloniality, its jargon becomes especially thick, casuistical, and imperious. I forget what those words mean. Casuistic means pertaining to casuistry, over subtle, intellectually dishonest, sophistical. That's according to dictionary.com. Wikipedia says casuistry is a process of reasoning that seeks to resolve moral problems by extracting or extending abstract rules from a particular case and reapplying those rules to new instances. This method occurs in applied ethics and jurisprudence. The term is also used pejoratively to criticize the use of clever but unsound reasoning, especially in relation to ethical questions, as in sophistry. It is defined as follows. Quote, study of cases of conscience and a method of resolving conflicts of obligations by applying general principles of ethics, religion, and moral theology to particular and concrete cases of human conduct. This frequently demands an extensive knowledge of natural law and equity, civil law, ecclesiastical precepts, and an exceptional skill in interpreting these various norms of conduct, ... end quote. Casuistry remains a common method in applied ethics. And what was the other word that I'm imperious? Imperious. How do you say that? Pronounce this word? I feel like an idiot.
Imperious.
Doesn't Lou Reed use that word in what's it? Velvet and Furs song. And imperious means marked by arrogant assurance, domineering, or befitting or characteristic of one of eminent rank or attainments, commanding, dominant. And 2, intensely compelling or urgent. I think it's referring to the first definition of domineering. Anyway, to this, an opposing, quote, decolonial option is held out to those of us prepared or culturally or ethnically predisposed to, quote, de-link, i.e. practice, quote, epistemic disobedience. In response to anyone rude enough to observe the intra-academic boundaries of decoloniality, its jargon becomes especially thick, casuistical, and imperious. Mignolo invokes, quote, the knowing of everyday living in communities for whom academic, scholarly, and scientific knowledge is perfectly irrelevant, end quote, leaving the reader to wonder, meanwhile, just how much, quote, decolonial theory these, quote, communities themselves are reading, ... or formulating. But Mignolo is careful to stipulate that, quote, delinking from Western epistemology and aesthetics doesn't equate with delinking from the institutions, end quote. Decoloniality must be, quote, introduced into the institutions, parenthesis, not relinked, question mark, in parenthesis, but, quote, carefully to avoid tainting, bracket it, and bracket, with academicism, end quote. While conceding that, quote, decoloniality could be fashionably consumed, end quote. The politics of decolonial investigations, like Britain's legendary King Canute, but without the latter's irony or humility, commands the tides to recede. Quote, the political tasks of decolonial work shall not be distracted by its fashionable consumption. End quote. Mignolo. And what's being referenced here is the story of King Canute and the Tide. It's an apocryphal anecdote meant to illustrate the piety or humility of King Canute the Great, also written as C-N-U-T, that's why I was saying Canute earlier, recorded in the 12th century by Henry of Huntingdon. In the story, Canute demonstrates to his flattering courtiers that he has no control over the elements, the incoming tide, explaining that secular power is vain compared to the supreme power of God. The episode is frequently alluded to in context where the futility of, quote, trying to stop the tide, end quote, of an inexorable event is pointed out, but usually misrepresenting Canute as believing he had supernatural powers, when Huntington's story, in fact, relates the opposite. Back to the text. Exercising the decolonial option further activates an impressively obfuscatory array of official decolonial neologisms, too overlapping, idiosyncratic, and numbingly baroque to catalog fully here, but the latter follow a consistent and garish pattern formed by the purely terminological correspondences, often redundant variations and pro forma substitutions that should be familiar to anyone reluctantly exposed to many modern intellectual and academic jargons. Thus, the westernization said to be antithetical to decoloniality gives us not only a corresponding, quote, de-westernization, end quote, but even a subsequent, explicitly counter-reformational danger of, quote, re-westernization. Still more, effectively synonymous with decoloniality and de-westernization is something Mignolo dubs in hushed tones, quote, the third nomos, the earth, end quote, an ironic and telling spin-off from Carl Schmitt. Footnote. See Carl Schmitt, The Nomos of the Earth in the International Law of Jus Publicum Europaeum, translated by G.L. Ullman, published with Teeler's Press in 2006. Originally published in 1950, Der Nomos der Erde terms the new world system inaugurated by the European discovery and colonization of the Americas, leading ultimately, and for Schmitt providentially, to the global hegemony of the United States, the Earth's, quote, second nomos. Mignolo has a curious penchant for conservative and right-leaning German intellectuals, including Oswald Spengler, of the decline of the West, for the presumably obvious reason, and Edmund Husserl, by analogy to whose logical investigations Mignolo claims to have conceived his own, quote, decolonial variety, end quote. I didn't know Edmund Husserl was right-leaning. Oswald Spengler, obviously. Anyway, end footnote. Meanwhile, the rise of what Mignolo terms the, quote, civilization states, end quote, as distinct from westernized nation states of contemporary Russia, China, India, and Iran, with Turkey sometimes added on for good measure, is cited in The Politics of Decolonial Investigations as a sign that a radically new era of de-westernization has dawned, and a telling indication how even relatively conjunctural, volatile, and reversible political oscillations and changes of government can evidently determine the difference between the, quote, West and its antithetical other. It is, according to The Politics of Decolonial Investigation, Decolonial Investigations. It is, according to Politics of Decolonial Investigations, only the fall of Lula and Dilma Rousseff and the decline of the Brazilian Workers' Party, PT itself, giving way to the election of Jair Bolsonaro in late 2018, that tipped Brazil over into the camp of re-westernization. Mignolo creates the impression here that Bolsonaro in fact took Brazil out of the BRICS summit, but this is false. Brazil itself, represented by the newly elected and fully engaged Bolsonaro, hosted the 11th BRICS summit in 2019. Bolsonaro continued to take part in both the 12th and 13th conclaves in 2020 and 2021, events at which the Brazilian head of state shared the podium with such, quote, de-westernizers as Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Narendra Modi. Regarding the, quote, civilizational state, that is India under Modi and the BJP, Walter Mignolo is, not surprisingly, all but silent, as he is regarding Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey and Iran under Ebrahim Raisi and the mullahs. Or Ebrahim Raisi and the mullahs. Where the latter are mentioned in passing, the jargon of coloniality, après Mignolo, takes on an equivocal flavor all its own. The current tendencies in China, Russia, India, and Turkey to mutate the nation-state into the civilization state are revealing signs of restituting what has been destituted. I'm not saying that civilization states will be, quote, better than nation-states. I'm just saying that most likely they will be. And who? God. BRICS, for Mignolo, becomes the CRI, China, Russia, and Iran, the, quote, three pillars, end quote, of de-westernization. Acronyms such as China, Russia, Iran, CRI, and the ubiquitous CMP, grandiose epochal markers such as the third nomos of the earth, and decoloniality itself, and especially prefixes acquire a partially significant and exalted status in the jargon of decoloniality. And again, CMP is colonial matrix of power. Quote, the change of era, bracket, from that of, quote, westernization to, quote, de-westernization, or, quote, decoloniality, end bracket, can no longer be captured by adding the prefix, quote, post. The post prefix is valid within re-westernization. The Counter-Reformation then intends to maintain the privileges built over 500 years of westernization, but it is meaningless for de-westernization and decoloniality. The prefix, quote, the prefix, quote, D takes the field, breaking up Western universality and totality into multiple temporalities, knowledges, and praxes of living, ... The D prefix means that you disobey and delink from belief in universality and unipolarity. You take what you need to restitute that which has been destituted, and that is relevant to the arising of multipolarity in the interstate relations and pluriversality, end quote. Walter Mignolo, The Politics of Decolonial Investigations. So much for the post-colonial, exclamation point. The, quote, D of the decolonial, as jealous as the God of the Old Testament, shall have no other prefixes before it. Quote, multipolarity and pluriversality are also continuously evoked lexical fixations in the Mignolo certified Jargon of Decoloniality. And multipolarity refers to, according to Wikipedia, a distribution of power in which more than two states have similar amounts of power. The Concert of Europe, a period after the Napoleonic Wars to the Crimean War, was an example of peaceful multipolarity. The great powers of Europe assembled regularly to discuss international and domestic issues, as was the interwar period. Examples of wartime multipolarity include World War I, World War II, the 30 Years' War, the Warring States period, the Three Kingdoms period, and the tripartite division between Song Dynasty, Lao Dynasty, Jing Dynasty, and Yuan Dynasty. Other jargons include, quote, destitution, quote, restitution, quote, the nociological, end quote, evidently replacing and substituting a decolonially suspect epistemological, in parenthesis, and, quote, aesthetics, or, quote, and, quote, aesthesis, or, quote, the aesthetic. I can't remember to say this right. Aesthesis, or aesthetic. Here at contrary decolonial aesthetics. But surely the most revealing feature of the jargon of decoloniality for the politics of decolonial investigations, pontificating instructions to the reader as to the genuine full meaning, epochal, eschatological, and bordering on the cosmic, of nothing more than a change of prefixes. Encountering such extremes of rhetorical swagger and display brings to mind the jargon of authenticity, Adorno's scathing and still timely critical expose of the debasement of language in the German existentialist philosophy of Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers, described at one point as a jargon determined, quote, by whether the individual words are loaded at the expense of the sentence, its propositional force, and the thought content, end quote. Adorno. Setting aside the question of whether the politics of decolonial investigation and the Mignolo-esque jargon of decoloniality, there still remains much, if any, sentence-level thought content available for sacrifice to the cult force of individual words. Mignolo here rests the very future of humanity on the variables of a linguistically subatomic level, on the difference between the quote D and the quote post. New section, section 3. After prolonged exposure to the jargon of decoloniality, the quote D and quote decolonial actually begins to sound more appropriate, signifying as it well might the erasure or reversal not of colonialism itself, but of colonialism's concept and historical referent. Why, after all, is there so little to be found in the politics of decolonial investigations? And generally throughout the decolonial screeds of Mignolo, concerning the specifics of colonialism itself, its material basis and conditions, not to mention the actual practically inexhaustible details of its historiography, anti-colonial movements proving no exception to this rule. Footnote: I find that there is little to be said about the politics of decolonial investigations' immediate precursor, 2018's On Decoloniality, which, aside from being co-authored by Mignolo and his sometime collaborator, Catherine E. Walsh, and its manifesto-like title, might as well have been included as an additional chapter or two in the longer collection that followed in 2021. End footnote. Whatever the deeper reasons for it, this factual deficit is crucial to the critique and critical decipherment of the jargon of decoloniality, almost as if its terminological extravagances and redundancies and its flat-out rhetorical hubris were ironic compensation for an underlying historical vacuum. Part of the answer will no doubt also reflect the typically contemporary and cosmopolitan purview of more vernacular calls to, quote, decolonize. While as a slogan, the latter does not necessarily ignore the historical impact of colonialism on questions of present-day racial injustice and struggles against the barriers set by national imperial privilege. Even the most practical and engaged demand for decolonizing does not usually get beyond the limits of identity politics and its conventional intellectual backdrop, culturalism. Wikipedia says in philosophy and sociology, culturalism is the central importance of culture as an organizing force in human affairs. It is also described as an ontological approach that seeks to eliminate simple binaries between seemingly opposing phenomenon such as nature and culture. I don't know if this is precisely what's being referred to here, but he's probably just referring to a non-materialist a materialist politics, a non-materialist politics here, or a non-materialist framework. Culturalism amounts to, back to the text, culturalism amounts, in brief, to the theory that cultural and ethnic identities and differences will ultimately explain the world. Accordingly, the cause of social emancipation comes to be defined and determined by, if not reduced to, the struggle against the myths of ethno-cultural inferiority and superiority that underlay an oppressive status quo. Mignolo and the jargon of decoloniality are no exceptions here. It is culturalism, in this sense, that constitutes the omnipresent horizon, delimiting what can and cannot be said in thought and works such as the politics of decolonial investigation. And in Mignolo's voluminous writings preceding it, stretching back at least as far as 2000's local history/global designs. Thus, although a work like the politics of decolonial investigations may outwardly appear to concern itself with history in history's objective reality and complexity, its historical scope and purpose are in fact severely constrained and impoverished. Although engaging in repeated general and sweeping invocations of the era, beginning in the late 15th century of European and Western world conquest and colonization, this one very general historical reference, with minor and incidental exceptions, is the only indication of Mignolo's interest in or commitment to historicizing decoloniality. There can be little point in exploring the deeper material historical basis of colonialism if, as Mignolo asserts, the quote, real itself is merely, quote, an epistemic projection, and if, quote, governance and economy, end quote, are no more than, quote, epistemic fabrications, end quote. Mignolo. The politics of decolonial investigations is always quick to proclaim the historic dawning, however embattled, of a new de-westernized era or a third nomos of the earth. But key categories such as the colonial matrix of power and decoloniality itself remain super-historical absolutes that possess near mythical origins not subject to historicization. To subscribe to Mignoloist decolonial theory is to relinquish any notion that the material and social factors that condition the historical formation and appearance of absolutes such as quote, the West, quote, de-westernization, and quote, decoloniality can themselves be investigated and determined. This is a rather stunning and scandalous state of affairs in any work claiming actual purchase on something as quintessentially historical as colonialism, including anti-colonialism and decolonization. It begs, among others, the question, to be addressed in the fourth and final section of this review, of how it is that any, quote, theory pertaining to colonialism, but practically devoid of both detailed historical reference and any intellectual engagement with contemporary struggles against neocolonialism and imperialism, would attract as many, quote, decolonial converts as it evidently has. But it follows logically and inevitably from the fundamental and disastrous category of mistakes to which culturalisms like Mignolo's are irrevocably condemned once they venture onto a terrain inviting a requiring historical explanation. Culture and ethnicity are of necessity explanandum, what must be explained before, as categories, they can become explanans, that is, capable of explaining anything else. And it is ultimately only history, a universal that resists and refuses culturalization, that conditions and makes this locally explanatory function a possibility. Mignolo's culturalism inevitably reduces the category of the universal itself, whence history as well, to the status of an artifact, if not an artifice, of a particular culture, that of Europe and the West. But, if by virtue of their purported cultural origin, all universals are really to be eliminated, the result would be cognitive paralysis. One can no more think, theorize, or criticize without the category of the universal than one can without that of the particular. A prescribed universality simply re-enters the jargon of decoloniality through the back door, as say de-westernization, decoloniality itself, or pluriversality. Why not go still further and issue a demand for, quote, pluri-universality? Yet more sinister implications follow from such a fallacy. By rejecting as Eurocentric and westernized all claims to universality, Mignolo, in the Politics of Decolonial Investigations, clears a path for the surreptitious re-entry of still other, thinly disguised universals far more insidious than the self-parodies like pluriversality, so long that is as they possess the alibi of being anti-Western. Indeed, Mignolo's explicit championing of the anti-Western, quote, civilization states of China, Russia, and Iran explodes a flagrant decolonial flirtation with autocracy and great nation chauvinisms. This is clearest in the Politics of Decolonial Investigations, open, explicit, and frequently reiterated endorsement of Xi Jinping's China and its challenge to re-westernization. For although, quote, decoloniality is not, end quote, and, quote, cannot be, end quote, a, quote, state-led task, end quote, de-westernization can only be advanced by a strong state that is economically and financially solid. That is why China is leading the way in this trajectory, end quote. After an oddly condescending and dismissive nod to Mao Zedong, parenthesis, clearly an uncomfortable and by and large dispensable presence on the decolonial scene, end parenthesis, Deng Xiaoping is credited by Mignolo with having de-linked China from Western dictates, as well as celebrated for having supposedly uncoupled capitalism from liberalism and neoliberalism. Quote, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, end quote, observes Mignolo, quote, was a sarcastic comment in Western media, and indeed it was and it is, and one could ask, what is wrong about that, end quote. Mignolo. At the risk of sinning against decoloniality, one is inclined to ask, along with evidently increasing numbers of young Chinese workers adhering to the philosophy of, quote, Tang Ping, and often to, quote, lie flat, rather than work endless hours just to at best remain in place, whether what is wrong with that is not just capitalism itself. Footnote. See Megan Day's article, China's Downwardly Mobile Millennials Are Throwing in the Towel, published in Jacobin, June 25th, 2021. End footnote. But Mignolo's sympathies and admiration for Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, and the upper echelons of the Chinese civilization state do not appear to extend to rank-and-file Chinese workers themselves. Mignolo's clear tendency to subordinate the class contradiction to the questions of cultural and ethnic hierarchy and difference, if not to ignore class altogether, cannot conceal a de facto decolonial endorsement of current ruling capitalist class policies, as long as they can be identified as, quote, de-westernizing. Meanwhile, Mignolo blithely dismisses the erstwhile Soviet Union, and with it an entire epoch in the history of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism of enormous, practically incalculable importance. There is nary a word in the Politics of Decolonial Investigations concerning the admittedly ambiguous, Cold War overdetermined but nevertheless historic Soviet role up through at least the 1970s in helping to advance unprecedented anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles, including those of the People's Republic of China itself, along with Cuba, Vietnam, and Angola. The USSR was, according to the Politics of Decolonial Investigations, quote, a failed way to deal with the imperial difference, because it was acting on a Western system of ideas which did not correspond with or emerge from Russian local history. What was local were the rage and anger against the Russian Tsarate, but the instrument, In this case, communism was borrowed, end quote. Mignolo, The Politics of Decolonial Investigations. No pan-Slavist, including Putin himself, would have put it any differently. That liberalism and Marxism, quote, the heirs of the Enlightenment, end quote, neither could nor did assume a local Russian form, must come as a shock to serious historians of 18th, 19th, and early 20th century Russia. Footnote. For a careful and powerful refutation of the false opposition between the local and the universal, see in particular Nivedita Mujumdar's The World in a Grain of Sand, Postcolonial Literature and Radical Universalism, published with Verso in 2021. Quote, postcolonial theories' misconceptions derive from an impoverished conceptual and normative repertoire, in which localism and universalism are not merely the only alternatives, but are also mutually exclusive. This leaves us with an exotic and essentialized localism and a Eurocentric universalism as our sole options. I contend that the rejection of Eurocentric theories can be complemented by embracing another richer and non-parochial form of universalism, end quote. Nivedita Mujumdar, ditto decoloniality, end footnote. Applying the criteria of such blatantly culturalist, indeed Orientalist ideology, one wonders how Mignolo would classify such pre-Soviet Russian historical and cultural figures as Peter or Catherine the Great, Alexander Pushkin, Ivan Turgenev, or Nikolai Chernyshevsky. Are these Western or local Russians? And what of the millions of imperial subjects of pre-Soviet Tsarist Russia who are not themselves ethnic Russians, or exclusively primarily Russian-speaking? Do they therefore lie outside Russian history? Putin and his followers might, to be sure, prefer to see things this way. Okay, so I'm going to make that the end of part 1. Thank you so much for listening. Part 2 starts with section 4.